Okay.
All right.
Oh, Alina, welcome.
Hi,
Welcome to
thank you.
Women Who Write. For those of you who are watching, I'm delighted that this afternoon we have. Oh, Alina, pronounce your last name for me.
Tugend.
It's a hard G.
It
Okay.
is.
Alina Tugend. And Alina is an award-winning journalist, and she writes for numerous national publications on education and on other topics, including the New York Times, the Atlantic, Washington Post, and Kiplinger. I never know what to do with that G either.
Kiplinger, you're right on that one.
Okay. From 2005 to 15, she wrote the weekly Shortcuts column for the New York Times business section. Alina is also the author of a book called Better by Mistake. It's an intriguing title. Better by Mistake, the unexpected benefits of being wrong. She also contributed a chapter to the book Mistakes I Made at Work. 25 influential women reflect on what they got out of getting it wrong. There's a theme here.
Yes, yes.
If you'd like to see more of her work, you can see it at www.alinatugend.com. So that's Alina, Alina, all one word, ALINATUGEND.com. Got it? We got it right? So welcome. I met Alina um, some time ago when she was doing an article about Title IX athletics, since it was the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And she was focusing on the transgender issue, which I consider a tempest in a teapot, but I think I communicated that to her. Um, so it was a really good interview, and I was really impressed with her skills and with the article that came out. So I asked if she would come be on Old Women Who Write, even though she isn't old, and she agreed.
Well, appreciate that. I don't know about that, but thank you.
Sure. So tell me first of all, what is the proper title for your job? Journalist?
Yes, I'm a journalist. I mean, you can say reporter, but I think journalist now is more encompasses someone who both writes and reports.
Gotcha. Okay. And what's your title for the kinds of things you write? Is it columns, pieces, articles? Is there a
I would say articles. I mean, I wrote columns. Columns tend to be more. I mean, my columns that I wrote for the Times generally had a first person element, meaning I included myself in them, even though they were reported, they weren't just essays. But columns tend to have a more personal touch. Not always, but and also they tend to be regular. Though again, you can write a one-off column, but it'd be more likely you'd write it on a regular basis. While articles are they could be feature articles, which would be more, what we would call soft news or daily breaking news. But yes, they're called articles rather than columns.
do what you are what's called a freelance journalist.
Yeah.
That means you get your own jobs or you do
Yeah,
not.
I mean, it's like so many people now. I mean, I've done this for quite a long time, but almost so many people now are independent contractors, whatever you want to call it. But freelance journalism has been around for an awfully long time. And yes, it means you don't write. I mean, it's exactly, someone, whether it's true or not, was said the term freelance came from, I think, centuries ago when you were maybe hired as a soldier, you were a freelancer, like a lance.
Oh,
So
really?
I don't know if that's true, but I saw that. And it's true. I don't write. You can be a freelancer and write regularly. I mean, I was a freelancer and wrote for the Times, probably more than a lot of reporters wrote a column, but it just means you're not on staff anywhere.
I
And
see.
you have the flexibility, but you don't get the benefits, you don't get the perks that you would have being on staff.
When I lived in Washington, D.C., I had a large number of friends who were contractors of various sorts, for all different reasons, from
Right.
military to administrative to whatever. And the majority of them, especially those who were new in the field, it took a lot of their time to find assignments, to
Right.
find contracts. Did you have to do that when you started freelancing, or do you have to do that now at all, or are you called?
Right. Um, certainly at the beginning, I mean, I was always a staff writer for newspapers in California and in Washington, D.C. and Rhode Island. And I then when we moved to London, my husband and I had two sons there and worked there. And then when we moved back, well, moved to New York, we hadn't lived there, we lived in California. I decided I would just freelance for a little while and thought I'd get another staff job. But I mean, it didn't hurt that my husband was a deputy business editor on the New York Times. That's the job he had come back for.
Sure.
But it helps to get the initial in, but you still have to prove that you can write. And so I was start writing for them. I wrote for something that's no longer here called the American Journalism Review, that was that covered how the press covers things, and a number of other places. So I did pitch stories. But I regularly wrote for the Times. And then when I was given the column in 2005, because I was raising two kids and I didn't want to work full time, that really took most of my time. So even though I have been at the point, certainly early on, where I had to pitch things, for quite a while, that hasn't been the case. And yes, people do come to me, and I have regular clients such as the New York Times or the Chronicle of Higher Education or Kiplinger, that the editors come to me with stories they want me to do. So I think it's very tough to have to keep selling yourself and pitching yourself. And I probably wouldn't have stayed in it. I never anticipated staying in it for over 20 years, but I probably would have just gone and got a job had I, as a journalist, had it not been for the fact that I could keep it moving.
I get the feeling that it's not an easy field to get into, and it's much easier if you have been a staff writer. So you have the experience of writing for newspaper.
Because people here always, a lot of people think they can write. A lot of people can write, but a lot of people can't. And so if an editor wants somebody who's experienced and he or she knows can tell that person what the assignment, or the person pitches an assignment and knows that they can pretty much deliver it on time, well done.
Yeah.
That's what they're going to want. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of them don't pay enough. They want to pay for experience. They want experience, but they don't want to pay for it. But generally speaking, if you don't have any clips, any experience, you're going to find it hard to break into established publications.
Makes sense. And which is kind of funny because, old women who write, the major intent of old women who write is to encourage women in their 70s, 80s, and 90s to write, to reclaim themselves in the world. And that's all great. And we can write novels, and we can write memoirs, and we can write how-to books and self-help books. I'm not sure we could be freelance journalists. I think it would be.
I think it's, like anything else, it has a certain, formula sounds like it's formulaic. I don't think it's formulaic, but it's got certain established ways of doing things. So it's very broad now, but mainly it's writing, it's knowing how to, because you're writing, but you also have to call people or go out and meet them and do research. It's not just the actual writing, it's knowing how to interview. It's knowing how to write things to a certain length and get it in on time. So it involves a lot of aspects.
That brings up something that I was thinking about, that writing for a newspaper is very specific. It seems it has to be very tight writing. It has to be
that's correct.
In my mind, it's a little like writing poetry. Every word counts, and excess words do not work.
It should. It should be like that. It isn't always. And of course, it depends. There are very long stories in newspapers or magazines. And with the internet, with all the bad things we say, it's a lot more space for writing and for photos to be displayed. So, there is more to it. There's more ability to write longer now. But yes, everything, you can't just sort of wander around. On a page, and it's not just because of space or time, but the assumption is the reader won't be that interested.
Right. Give us an idea of when you were writing, for instance, the Title IX story, which ran about how long? how big a piece was it?
I mean, I think that ended up being about 1,500 words, maybe, something like that. So
Right.
yeah, I usually count by word.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you were writing
So
that,
that would be if you were typing double space, if you were typing double spaced on a computer, you would probably end up with about 2.5 pages.
gotcha. Okay. So when you were writing it,
Okay.
about how many phone calls did you make and to talk to
Yeah.
individuals about the content of your piece?
Um, I would say on that one, maybe 6 or 7. I had some background on it. I had written the story for the New York Times on the Title IX museum show at the New York History Museum, and so I didn't need to get a lot of background information on Title IX. I think it was maybe 8, which is a lot for a story that size. It's actually
Mhm.
quite a bit because realistically, you just can't include. You can't when you think about actually quoting people, and when you think about giving information, that's you can't. That a lot of stories may have 3 or 4 sources. It just depends what you're saying. I was trying to get in a lot of voices from yourself, from others who were there at the beginning of Title IX or have been actively involved in implementing or writing about it. And so this was really about the voices. It wasn't a story about should transgender women be allowed to participate in sports as
Mm,
much as it was about, which would have been a different story and would have had to have experts and voices. This was about what you and those women think now compared to how being at the beginning of Title IX and now 50 years later, this one issue that has come up. And what are your thoughts on that?
gotcha. Yeah. Matter of fact, I was in New York the week of all of the celebrations in DC for Title IX, and there were a
That's a
number of
shame.
them.
Yeah,
A whole
there
bunch of
certainly were.
people
There were quite a
who
few.
used to work for
That
the
was,
Office for Civil Rights got together for dinner, who did early enforcement. I know that the Women's Legal Foundation, that's not the correct title, in DC, they had a big event. It was a big deal,
yeah,
a really big
it
deal.
was a big deal.
That I
It was,
missed.
it was a big deal. I
Yeah,
believe Margaret Dunkel invited me to a few of those, but I wasn't in Washington
yeah.
either. So,
I know. I wanted to be at that dinner with Margaret Dunkel and couldn't be. But
yeah,
what
yeah.
when you are writing, it seems to me there are differences in the kinds of pieces that you write. I mean, I would think one is entirely informational, maybe, and then there's what you just described, an issue that, even though it isn't the focus, has a couple of sides to it, and you want to
Mhm,
get some balance in how you're
mhm.
presenting it, I would think, right?
I don't know if I would divide it by informational and side. I mean, I think of a lot of my journalism as explanatory. I don't think, I think it's more, I think that there's all different types of journalism, but most of mine tends to be taking an issue that, uh, and trying to explain to people things they may not know or things that may appear counterintuitive,
Uh,
or putting it like yours with the one you participate, which I putting in some historical context. So it obviously depends what the editor wants,
mhm.
but that was a case of an editor reaching out to me after reading the story in the New York Times and asking me to write that. But I think that um, it there's stories, more often there might be a story that's less uh, newsy or less off the news, as this one was for Title IX. But I think like my columns weren't about, they could, but usually they had nothing to do with news. I like to say I like to write about making people relook at a subject in a different way.
Oh, give me an example of that.
Well, even the Title IX one was something like that, the one that you're talking about, because I think most people would say, oh, Title IX, first of all, as we know, most people think it's just about sports. So this was giving a little information that it wasn't just about that. But
Right.
also, most people, understandably think fairly ahistorically. And so, the idea that transgender issue, oh my God, Title IX's never faced anything like this, or this is something completely different than anything anyone thought about. And you hear that things like that. And the reality is no. When Margaret Dunkel shared her memo that she had written on how collegiate sports, and a lot of the issues were exactly the same that is being debated about transgender. I didn't know that. My editor found it fascinating. So it's not just plowing the same ground over and over. Or, with my columns, I really like doing that. I got tired of hearing everyone say, all you need to do is find a passion and then you'll have a job, which I felt like that's, sure, you can have a passion for baking, but that certainly doesn't mean you can make money at it. And I like to take what sort of become cliches of the day and look at them more deeply. And
Oh, I
what does that
see.
really mean? Yeah.
I like that. I like that idea. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little like punctured
Yeah.
balloons.
Yeah, because I mean, people tend to just repeat the same. I mean, it's just the way it is. Where in a lot of media, a lot of 24-hour media, let's say the women's magazines, you're saying, I wrote one on how complaining isn't that bad, and I think that's what I like doing is looking at another side of things.
Can you tell from it maybe more difficult to tell when you're working as an individual rather than part of a company? How common is it for women to be in your field and to be successful?
I certainly it wasn't, in back in the day. I mean, I think of people who know My Girl Friday or something. It was the movies about um, reporters, and sassy woman reporter would be an exception. But now it's very common. It's not an unusual. A lot of women are in the field. Yeah, certainly a lot of journalists. Again, it may still be that at the very top you
Yeah,
don't have women, but near the top you do. I'm not saying there's not sexism. I'm not saying there's not bias against women. I'm sure people could point to that. I
yeah,
personally, but you're right, I'm not in a newsroom, and I mean, but someone I know, there's an organization called uh, the acronym is awful, it's JAWS, but it's Journalism and Women Symposium. And it was started by women in the 1970s from Newsweek and other publications who had sued for equal pay and for not being pushed just to write in the women's
yeah.
sections. And it's still active. And in fact, the president has just been hired as the editor-in-chief of the Chicago Sun-Times. And she's a woman of color, and she's, a woman. And so it just seems like there's no shortage of women. Again, I wouldn't say it's all good, it's all free and clear, but I don't believe in terms of hiring, in terms of bias, there's an issue there.
At one point I was working for a government organization called the International Broadcasting Bureau, which was
Hmm.
the umbrella organization over all US international broadcasting. So it was the
Oh,
Voice of
interesting.
America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty,
Right.
Radio Free China, Cuba.
Mhm.
Actually, we never sort of got into Cuba. We kept shooting down the balloons or something.
Yeah.
Um, but there was, when I went to work there, there was a 20-year-old lawsuit, or more than 20 years old lawsuit, still happening from the women who worked for the Voice of America and were paid
Yeah.
substantially less. And these were reporters, journalists, radio, different media
Yeah.
journalists. Um, and it was still going. And I hope that I helped get it done and I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of the plaintiffs had died. It was
Geez.
about 20
That's,
years.
yeah, that's, yeah, there's a book called, I think it's something, The Good Girls Rebellion or The Good Girls Revolution, that's about, it's written by a journalist. It's about journalists and the lawsuits they brought
Well,
and fight for equality in journalism.
yeah, I think the women in journalism have been active,
Yeah.
really active.
Yeah.
Now, did you find or at all that you have gotten not I'm not talking about by some other.
Jean, I'm sorry, Jean, can I interject? Now we have a, sorry. I just want to say, this is not so true with people of color. I think
Uh-huh.
it's it's a big battle and still very lopsided in terms of journalists of color
Right.
in newsrooms and elsewhere.
I interviewed a woman named Jill Nelson, who was the first African American female working on the Washington Post magazine. And she wrote something, I think the title begins, My Years of Involuntary Servitude, or something,
Yeah, I mean, and
just
it's
horrible.
still a big fight. It's still a big fight. And, I'm in touch with a lot education journalists, I know, because that's what I do the most. And there's still a big discrepancy between those who cover it, who are mainly white and middle class, and those who are in the public schools, which tend to be people of color and often more lower income. So
Yeah.
just wanted to point that out.
Thank you for
Mhm.
pointing that out. That's right.
Mhm.
Do you find yourself at all, because of what you've been writing, sort of slotted? For instance, I have a friend who lives in Baltimore, and she's a freelance journalist, and she's gotten known for her interviews
Hmm.
with really more B-list celebrities,
Yeah,
so that's what she does almost full time, is she,
interesting.
interviews,
Yeah,
and she doesn't mind. Do you
yeah.
feel any that you, because of what you've done, got slotted into a
Well,
certain?
I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There's always been beats in journalism, what you cover, whether it be I started one of the environment beats on a paper in Los Angeles that cover the courts, you cover, education. And so my beat more or less now would be considered education, although I still write on personal finance. But so yes, now that I write on education, people reach out like they did with the Title IX story, will reach out and say, can you write this? I've become within this small circle of
Yeah,
education publications. Um, I'd say I've been known, and I don't mind. I always liked writing about a lot of different things, but right now I enjoy writing about education, although it's not the only thing. I sometimes write about museum shows for the Times, but I like being a generalist, but it isn't good. I do enjoy having some expertise in a field,
yes,
and education is so broad and so much is going on that it's pretty much never boring.
right. We sort of touched on this earlier, but talk to me about, how do you see that writing, how journalism is different than other forms of writing? In what ways?
Right. And I just want to interject. I just looked it up. It's The Good Girls Revolt. And that's
Oh,
about the journalists. And it also was a TV show. So it was a book and then a TV show. So it's a Good Girl Revolt. Anyhow, back to your question. I think journalism, I mean, it is what we touched on, that has a certain, not as much as it used to. Used to be taught you write for news stories, you write in the inverted pyramid, which means everything important is at top and then at the bottom. So you can be just sliced off if there's not room for it at the bottom. I'm not saying that's not true, but it's less true now than that there was sort of this very formulaic way of writing news stories. But I also think you have to be, I mean, there's obviously always controversy about this, but you have to be aware you're not presenting yourself, you're presenting the issue and the topic, and you have to be aware of what biases you bring. Everybody has biases. Nobody's going to come in unbiased, but you do, someone said you can't get rid of your biases, but you can get the facts right. And of course, unfortunately, now we also have whole disagreement on what facts are. But I think that journalism, and I'm talking a little more about news journalism, straight news journalism.
yes,
Obviously, you can have feature stories that people bring themselves in and say, I met so-and-so and we had this talk, and you can talk on. But I think for the type of journalism I like doing, which I do like doing features, and I've done a few, I've done magazine, I've done personal essays, but the idea is really that to me, it's not only how you write it, which has a particular type, like you said, type form, but also, am I getting people represented or points of view represented that maybe usually aren't? Am I not just calling the same old sources over and over? So, this is one thing you have to be very aware of. Am I just calling white men, or am I just calling white women? Depending on the story. Obviously, with some stories, they're just experts, and that's who they are, and you need to call them. So that's part of it.
Tell me about, there's a thing that I consider the balance issue. And this is again more for, I think, for reporters reporting on today's news.
Yeah, the politics are
kind of work you're doing. But I served for about 6 years in a little city in Florida as a city commissioner. And the big issue was the ogre developer, who was destroying the island basically that I was living on at the time. And so the reporters would come from Sarasota newspapers, whoever, and interview me about, and I would show them the evils, the depredation, the whatever.
Right.
And I was always in shock when they would go then to the developer, who would tell his side of the story, and they would always treat the two in my brain. There was something lost in a sense of, well, you're not there just to give both sides. Is there no?
Well, yeah. Well, that's a growing, since Trump got elected to office, that's been I'm not saying it didn't exist before, but it's become a growing debate on that. You don't give equal, it's not equal. Not all sides are equal. You don't sit there and just say A is equal to B. One side disagrees, so it's equal to the side that agrees. Exactly. And how you do that. The Trump presidency forced journalists, for good probably, for the most part, to reevaluate how they report.
Good.
And newspaper, not just individuals, newspapers as a whole. This is a little off topic, but there was a whole question. The Times, called him a liar. They would never, ever, they had to make a big decision and explain why they were doing that. And I remember National Public Radio didn't do that. They would not call him a liar. And I had a whole talk with someone who was discussing that. And he said, you have to know a frame of mind, but that you don't know if he's intending to lie. But so I'm just saying there were so many changes that, and then the part of it is this balance issue is, do you just repeat what someone says, even if it's known as a lie? And you can see that newspapers started saying, we know, he falsely repeated, or, about Trump or someone else. And it may seem small to some people, but these were a big shift in papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And
I did not know that.
Yeah, that there was a lot of thought about how to change things. I'm sure it looked too minor for people who wanted to see more, but I think that there is that sort of give equal weight is being viewed and rethought. Local papers are different than national papers, and I tend to write more for national. They have more, whatever they're trying to cover. It's slightly different. And but what I've also learned is people read things into stories you never thought they would. They see things as, I'm not saying they see things, you say something you think is very neutral, and they'll say, no, this, you obviously were biased against this. And it's good to hear, sometimes I disagree. Sometimes it's like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Okay. But if someone knows a topic well, they're almost always going to disagree with how you reported it.
I see.
Because we're not writing scholarly articles.
Right. But they're going to say, oh, you left out, or you an important fact, or that.
Yeah. And you didn't give it the proper nuance. It's like, right. You try the best you can, but again, if you were to write an academic piece, the New York Times readers, that's not what they're looking for.
Got it. Well, tell me what was your favorite assignment ever? Your favorite piece that you ever did?
Right. Definitely one of my favorites was a story, because I just was so interesting. A story I did for a magazine that was, you may have known it, working. It was called Governing. It was for the federal government. So that seems odd. When I was freelancing, when I was first starting here, but they signed me to interview Kenneth Feinberg, who was at that point, this is right after 9/11, that point was he was in charge of the September 11th Victims Fund. And I went to Boston and I interviewed him, and it was just a fascinating, it wasn't just about him, it was also about how did it get created? What was the point? How do you balance people's lives? How do you balance what a life is worth?
Yeah.
So it was fascinating to me. It was this whole idea of this. And then, as we know, I mean, that was before he started being appointed as this overseer or whatever, I can't remember the proper term, for so many of these kind of funds, for the British Petroleum Fund, so he became kind of the man. But I found it, to me, that was one of, I mean, I've been able to do, I did a story out of Siberia in Russia, for a paper I wrote for in Orange County, California, because there were two professors who were studying this secret city where nuclear waste had been dumped in Siberia, Chelyabinsk. And I could go with them because they were local, but I went with them and covered and reported on the people there. And that was a special section. So I've been very fortunate to do actually a lot of pieces that were really quite fascinating in different ways. But I really I'm not an investigative reporter. I've done some. I really admire people can do it, but you have to have a stomach of iron. You have to not care what people think of you. You have to just be willing to dig and dig and dig. And I'm willing to dig, but I don't like the feeling that people hate you. And I really admire investigative reporters who, and like I said, I've done some of it, and it's great when you do it and it comes out, but you really have to have a certain thing. I think my real skill and talent, I think I'm a good writer, but really to explain difficult things in a way that's simple, but not simplistic.
Yes, I hear that. Given the title of your book, won't get it quite right. The unexpected benefits of being wrong, better by mistake. What was the worst experience you ever had in writing an article?
It's funny that book came out of an article, because I mean, I wouldn't say this is the worst. I mean, I'm not sure. I've never had an experience where I've written something that's just somehow turns out to be completely wrong. I mean, for whatever reason, or that I completely missed the point of it, at least that I know of. But I think that why I wrote that, the column, which was very popular, and then that book grew out of it, is that when you're in the Times, if my column, anything you write in the Times, anything you write anywhere, you run a correction, but somehow having a correction in the Times obviously just feels really bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels bad anywhere, but it's appended to the bottom of the story.
What did you have?
Yeah, and no matter how minor it is, they're going to run a correction. That's not true, and it just, I had just made a small mistake in a story. It was something about daylight savings time. And I just, because readers love to point these things out to you. And I was like, oh, shoot. And, we did a correction. And what I started thinking about is why we get so upset when we make mistakes. We're taught we learn by making mistakes, but that sort of disappears. So I think probably what I've beaten myself up for are small mistakes that you keep thinking, oh, I could have done it. I could have, but the reality is a story can go through you and 3 editors and people don't catch, because that's just human factors. I mean, not obviously, if you're making mistakes all the time, there's a problem, but once in a while, it's just the reality of it. But it's very hard when it's so public.
Yes. Have you ever had real blowback from any story you've written, from an individual or corporation?
Have I had blowback? What I had is when I'd write my columns, if I wrote something on technology, I'd get people, some of the techies would be I mean, it wouldn't be a very technical, it would be about computers I get techie people just saying, you're such an idiot. How can you even write for the New York Times? How did the Times even print something so stupid? And I mean, that was the kind of blowback, and at first it's completely I mean, don't forget, before the internet, you rarely heard from anyone unless they took the time to sit down, find out how to contact you, write you a letter, maybe a phone call. Then
Envelope,
when I
stamp,
was writing,
mail.
right, exactly. I mean, it was pretty rare. And then when I started at the Times in this column, it was usually emails. I had my email, the shortcuts email, and then I'd get these emails from people really just, you know, berating me for something they thought that was wrong. And it would feel bad until you had to learn to just,
Yeah.
where is this coming from? And then you do have comments. The comment section, some journalists say, don't ever make the fatal mistake of reading the comment section on your story. So, I think we've all had blowback in different ways. It's just, you have to figure out who's legitimate, whose criticism is legitimate and whose
Yeah.
isn't.
Have you ever had the urge to write any other kind of like fiction?
I used to when I was much younger. I mean, just for myself, or I'd take some writing classes. I used to write poetry.
Oh,
Now I don't as much. I really thought I might write a novel at some point. And I don't know what's changed, but partially I think I realize how incredibly hard that is. I mean, it's a very different type of writing. And I think it's incredibly hard to get good dialogue down. And partially I do enjoy this type of writing. I mean, maybe I'd write another nonfiction book. I don't have to, it's just a thought. But, I think that I have, and I read a lot of fiction. I really enjoy it. And I really did think that would be more in my trajectory, but it hasn't turned out that way.
and is you feel the same way about what you mentioned? Any other nonfiction book?
I mean, I could see writing it. I mean, I certainly would feel more comfortable writing a nonfiction book. It's not as, it's always good to challenge yourself. And I'd like to try different things. I'd like to try a podcast. I mean, I don't think I would start one, but maybe work, I don't know. But, I think it's always really good to try to challenge yourself.
I'd be great at it. What
Mhm.
I've discovered in, I've 20 whatever years of writing legal persuasive
Mhm.
memos, trying to affect policy or
Right,
explain policy
right.
to the world.
Yeah,
That when I started writing memoir, it's such a different landscape. I mean, it's a different universe. There's
well, I
a
have to say, I was asked by a Canadian company that writes memoirs for people to write a memoir of
really,
someone else. So I did the interviews, an
oh,
older gentleman who
yeah,
lived in New York, so I was close, and I did do that, and it was not my memoir, and but and it's not going to be published. It's just for him and his family,
yeah,
but it got edited, and it was a different kind of writing, and that was fun.
it is. I think a big difference I see is vulnerability that has to exist
Mhm.
if you are writing
Absolutely.
memoir or fiction. You
Yeah.
have to be willing to let yourself be out there
Yeah.
on the table for, for the people.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. That's very different.
Yeah,
Yes, I
it
agree.
is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Um, this is another one of those questions that I suppose everybody asks in an interview. What advice would you give to someone considering journalism, particularly freelance, but just journalism?
I mean, it's funny, the field has changed so much since I started, which, was more than 40 years ago, that it's hard to say, but I think I do know younger people have gone into it now, and some have followed the same path, which was basically you started, if it's the internet didn't exist then, but you started a small paper or small
Yeah,
publication, and you worked your way out. That still exists, but more likely there's so many more outlets now that it can be a national publication. I think you really have to have a passion for it, in my opinion. You have to, when I started, and that was in the 80s, when I talked to older journalists when I was looking at jobs, they always told me, it's falling apart. Journalism is going downhill. And, really the 80s and 90s were in some ways the golden age of journalism in certain
mm,
ways. So people have always said journalism is falling apart. And I think take that with a big grain of salt. It still exists. I
yeah,
think you have to just, I don't think, I mean, it depends. I didn't go to graduate school in journalism. I did undergrad. Some people do. I think you really have to love it. You have to read a lot. And I think that's another mistake. I've had people who say, I want to be a journalist, but they obviously don't ever read in publication, read news, read anything. And
Right.
If you want to be a fashion journalist, maybe just follow fashion if you want to, but you can't not read what you hope to do one day.
Makes all kinds of sense. Do you know,
Yeah.
this is a little off topic when you mentioned the changes in journalism. I have a friend named Michael Rosenblum who started New York One. He started the
Yeah.
video revolution. And as
Okay.
one part of that, at one point, and I think it was in the 90s, but I'm not even sure. No, early 2000s, I think. He trained all the New York Times reporters to do their own video stories.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and he did the same with the BBC, and he's now doing it with all of what's one of the common cable companies around the country who all have their little
Yeah.
news operations. He's training
Yeah.
all of them. So,
Oh,
and
interesting.
that's one of the shifts, I think,
Exactly.
in journalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that happened.
That's one of the shifts. Yeah. And also when I started, since there was no social media, since there was no internet,
Yeah.
you really were, you worked long hours, you worked hard, but you weren't expected to be on 24 hours a day all the time. Sure, if you were covering a big story, you did, but now you're supposed to tweet out all the time. You're supposed to post,
That's right.
and that it's really, in that sense, different.
That's a lot of self-promotion that social media thing.
It has to be done, and just putting and not even self-promotion. It's if you're covering, Biden's news conference, you've got to be putting out, he's speaking about this now, he's speaking about that, because some people are going to be following it live on Twitter, and that's a big difference.
Yeah, it is. It is. Wow. Would you believe 40 minutes has gone work by?
I know, that just flew by. Yeah.
And I really enjoyed talking with you. Is there anything else you wanted to say or I should have asked?
No, I think you did a great job covering all the bases. And I think, I think if people want to write, since that's what the podcast, writing is great. There's all different types of writing.
Yes.
Most people won't be published, or they can self-publish, as you said. And, but writing is, I think it's a great thing to start, especially when you're older. One of my favorite stories you mentioned when you asked me that was, I wrote it in the LA Herald Examiner, which is now defunct, but it was a writing class for older people who wanted to write their memoirs. Oh. And so that was much more unusual. That was much more unusual back then, but we got photos, we ran excerpts of it, it was front page. It was just, and people loved it fun. Because it was, and this was in the late 80s. So you can imagine what they were writing about, back then. And again, it was nothing to be published, but it was just, and it was a teacher with about 7 or 8 students, in some class. And it was lovely. So I think that, I think it's a great idea for this podcast.
Yes, thank you. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. The day that somebody made it clear that I was viewed as old, I just got so pissed off. I did that. I knew I had to do something to reclaim our place in the world. So
good for you.
So thank you. And I hope everybody who's watching and listening has enjoyed it. That's it. I appreciate you. Thank you, Alina.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it.